All right, thank you. Thank you to the organizers of the 2021 Agile Online Conference. Thank you to everyone who made out time to be here today. It's a privilege, it's an honor to be here today to share a few thoughts about agility, the African continent, and how we can move ourselves forward. Well, my name is Ido Wakinde. I'm an agile coach. Sometimes I double as a product coach. Essentially, I help product teams to build, the optimal product. I have a couple of slides here that I'd like to share with us. Just as a framework to discuss a couple of thoughts about the relationship, if such exists, between the levels of agility and the levels of poverty and its inverse, wealth, right, at the national levels. So I have a few data sets here that I'd like to share with us. We can look over them together, and I'll have a section for comments at the end of the day. So without much further ado, next slide. Okay, so this is an intro. This is an example of what we will be looking at today. Under the intro, we'll take a few definitions: agility, poverty, correlation, and hypothesis. And then we'll go into, actually formulating a hypothesis, and then examining the data available, and then, drawing some conclusions. So, next slide. Those definitions, okay. I always like to define terms that are to be used in any presentation, especially when you have such a topic like agility, to whom a wide variety of people claim expertise, right? To whom there's a lot of claims. Within there's lots of claims, of expertise. So, for the purpose of this conversation, agility may mean something else, depending on the framework you support or adopt, depending on the community you are discussing with. But for the purpose of this particular conversation, let's agree, for the sake of this conversation, that agility means the ability to move quickly and easily. I always like that definition. I've always liked it since the first time I came to Agile, to the Agile movement. It's also the ability for an organization to rapidly, a more formal definition is the ability for an organization to rapidly adapt to environmental changes, right? Some of those environmental changes may come from regulation, the market, the industry, stimulus that affects them. The ability to react favorably to stimulus can also be called agility. An organization that finds itself unable or difficult, right, to react to stimulus in its environment naturally is considered not agile. So that's that. So I have as a third point there. I have something that I would like us to adopt as a measure. Again, there are many ways to measure agility. I don't think, because we're talking about nations and their respective levels of agility, it wouldn't be appropriate to use the traditional team-based metrics: velocity, cumulative flow, sprint, burn down, burn up. That kind of sounds too technical, too far off, not appropriate for the national level. So I thought, which KPI, which metric can someone use to measure agility at a national level? And I landed on PDI, okay? PDI, I didn't define here, that's an error, but PDI stands for Power Distance Index. Power Distance Index essentially is defined as the distance between subordinates, the psychological distance between subordinates and their superiors. In other words, the relative ease, or by extension, the relative difficulty for subordinates to disagree with their superiors without any negative consequence. So, at the family level, at the team level, at the work level, at the social level, wherever there is authority, there is also almost always a degree of ease and or difficulty with which the people who generally are the subordinates are able to agree or disagree with, disagree essentially without consequence with the authorities. And we'll use that as a working measure, right, of agility. Because if you think about it, what does it mean to be agile in an organization or at a national level? It means the ability to be responsive to stimulus. Responsiveness to stimulus essentially implies an openness to receive ideas, right? Especially if they are ideas that are not necessarily coming from the top cadre of the leadership, whether at the board, whether at the organizational level or at the national level. Responsiveness to stimulus or openness to stimulus means some degree of allowance and also openness to ideas and contributions and suggestions from all cadre of the team, whether they are junior or senior staff. So that's that. Moving on. 1 second, I'll spend a lot of time on that. Again, to define poverty, poverty essentially is the state of not having enough resources, whether material or other resources that are required for basic needs. Okay, and the measure that we use for poverty here is GDP, but it's GDP adjusted for something called the purchasing power parity. So it becomes GDP PPP. Essentially, what the purchasing power parity means is that if you think about the median income and the cost of goods, the average cost of a meal in New York versus Lagos, then it may not make absolute sense, it may not make complete sense to interpret the absolute GDP of the average New Yorker and compare it with the GDP of the average Lagosian. And compare that with the GDP of the average Lagosian. So there's always the concept of a relative consideration for income parity and purchasing power parity, essentially kind of discounting or weighting people's local ability to buy things. So if someone earns $100,000 per annum in New York and another person earns the equivalent of $50,000 per annum in Lagos, for all intents and purposes, they may be able to afford the same lifestyles. Because in Lagos, you may be able to afford a decent meal in some parts of Lagos, right? With maybe 500 to 1,000 naira, right? At least a decent meal, not a fantastic meal, maybe a decent meal for 1,000 naira. 1,000 naira is translated to dollars is about $2. You probably will not be able to buy yourself anything, again, reasonable or significant in terms of a complete meal in New York, for that kind of price. So that's the thinking behind the GDP and the PPP that is adjusted to it. So those are by way of definition. The third definition is correlation. Okay, correlation stands for the relationship between two variables or two aspects of a data set, and you can think of correlation in terms of three aspects. There's positive correlation, there's negative correlation, and there's zero correlation. If you look on the right side of this screen, to the right you have an upwardly trending graph, essentially saying that there is a positive, so when it's upwardly trending, there is a positive correlation between the two variables, meaning that an increase in variable 1 usually results in an increase in variable 2. That is essentially just the definition, and that's what it means to have a positive correlation. On the negative side, what it means to have a negative correlation is that an increase in variable 1 leads to not an increase this time around, but a corresponding decrease in variable 2. So in that case, if you look at negative correlation charts there, you see that as X progresses, Y drops. So what that means is, for instance, is it possible that in any population, as people are vaccinated against a certain disease, then the number of occurrences or deaths occurring by that disease should drop. So there should be a negative correlation between vaccinations and appearances of a particular disease. So that's a no-brainer. Zero correlation is when there is no visible or obvious pattern in the data. Very simple definitions. And then a hypothesis is just an experiment, right? But technically speaking, you can think about a hypothesis as a statement that someone puts forth to elicit arguments and or discussion, so that at the end of those arguments and or discussions, the group together can come to a consensus or a conclusion. So there is the need to make some assumptions, to make some, I always like some degree of faith, right? Express some degree of faith, even though they say it's a scientific method, right? So there's a need to go out on a limb and make a statement, right? Make a statement, and that statement forms your hypothesis. Then use the scientific methods, use the available testing methods, and use the power of the community that you are sharing that hypothesis with to debate that matter, and let's together as a community arrive at a definition, an acceptable definition. So that's what we'll be using. So those are our definitions. Now let's go to the actual work. The actual work here is that we're going to actually be saying our actual hypothesis here is that there is a negative correlation between agility and poverty. So my assertion, my assertion today, and we're going to put this to the test, is that there is a negative correlation between agility and poverty. In other words, I'm saying that the more agility increases in nations, well, starting first in organizations, the more agility, as we've measured it by power distance index, increases, then the more poverty decreases, right? In nations. So that's the hypothesis. How will we test it? We will use some data sets that are available online to analyze the information. And essentially, our expectation is that if we find data that shows that rich countries are more agile, in other words, rich countries show a higher degree of agility. Again, in other words, rich countries tend to have low PDI scores. Remember, PDI stands for power distance index. And power distance is defined, PDI, power distance index, is defined as the relative ease for subordinates to speak to authorities, to speak to their superiors without fear of retaliation or negative consequences. So my assertion, right, the test strategy is to see if there is data in the public domain that corroborates that when rich countries let me just cut my breath. So is there data that shows that rich countries sorry, am I the only one that can admit? Okay. Is there data that shows that rich countries are more agile? And I gave two alternative definitions of more agile. More agile means they have higher levels of agility, higher levels of nimbleness and responsiveness to stimulus. And two, they have lower power distance indices. They have lower PDIs, okay? And conversely, is there also data that demonstrates that poor countries, by deductive logic, is there data that demonstrates or that shows or that proves that poor countries have higher PDIs? In other words, is there a general observable phenomenon among poor countries that it is difficult for subordinates, both at the business and both at the organization and at the national level in poor countries? It is generally difficult for subordinates to speak to their superiors and or authorities without fear of negative consequence. Then, if we can find that condition to be true, then we would have established that indeed there is a negative correlation between, as we said, agility and poverty, or poverty and agility. So that's the background. That's tilling the ground. That's preparing the ground for what we want to look at. So looking at the data, okay, there's a couple of, and I wonder if it will be more efficient to actually share browser screens, right? But that may be a bit of back and forth. Okay, so let me just go ahead. Okay, can I zoom? Yes, economies of scale. Thank you, Adida. Let me look for the controls. Can I zoom? I don't think I can zoom. Okay. Can I just ask the audience, can you see where my mouse is pointing? Can you see the countries under that column?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So
Yes.
if it's level,
Yes, we can.
let me not worry too much. Okay. So there's a URL here, the Global Finance magazine, right? They have published this data set, and it's pretty recent. They published it in 2020, in April of 2020, leveraging data from from the IMF. Yes, leveraging data, 2019 data from them. So that is the maximum 2 years. So it's not too bad. Okay. Essentially, this data set is the PPP, which is the GDP that is adjusted for its local efficiency. Like I said earlier, it will not be fair, it will not be reasonable, it's not entirely reasonable to compare the absolute GDP, right, of the average New Yorker with the absolute GDP of the average Lagosian, because dollars, what a dollar can buy in New York is not the same as what a naira can buy in Lagos, right? I use the example of a meal. You can probably buy the average meal you can probably buy because probably rice and chicken or something like that. Maybe at a restaurant or something like that, and that would probably cost you maybe 1,000. What is the equivalent cost? What is the cost? What's the corresponding cost of a standard entry level meal, right, in New York? Is it likely to be $2 to $3? I don't think so. So that's the thinking behind the GDP PPP. It's a common way used by economists and statisticians to adjust GDP for local environments. Okay, so you see here that for those of you that are in the States and are very patriotic, US comes at number 11. Okay, but you see here that when you adjust GDP for PPP, in other words, how much bank can you get for the local buck that you're spending, right, per country? You find that Qatar, Macau, Luxembourg, Singapore, Ireland are the top 5 richest countries, right? When I saw the data set, I smiled because this is not what I was expecting. I was expecting Switzerland, Norway, Finland to be in the top 3, and then maybe North America, US, Canada, and so on and so forth. But hey, that's the data, so that's that. Essentially, what they're saying here is this is what the top 15 richest countries look like. Okay, stopping there at Iceland. To the right of that data set, right, the one to the right of the GDP PPP data set is the power distance index data set. Okay, so the power distance index again measures the relative ease for subordinates in a particular locale, in this case, in particular countries, to speak to their superiors without fear of negative consequence. And you have those countries there. Surprisingly, Malaysia, surprisingly, Egypt, right? African countries, surprisingly, Philippines, Guatemala, Venezuela, right? With all of the economic challenges and stuff like that. So you wonder, but hey, the data is the data, right? And we have to respect. We're empirical. Empiricism is one of the pillars of agility. So we respect the data. Let me put it like that. The next slide is the inverse. So now let's look at poor countries. And now we're not looking at Africa just yet. We haven't started discussing Africa. This is just poor countries. Okay. In the next slide, we'll take a narrow view on Africa. But for now, we're still discussing poor countries. So again, the same URLs, right? But this time around, if you look at the where my mouse is hovering, of course, the header is cut off by now, but these are the bottom 15. So this technically, these are the bottom 15 in the same table that I showed us in the other place, okay? However, you discover that coincidentally, 14 out of these 15 countries are African countries. The lowest countries for a, how do you call it? The countries with the lowest local bang for their buck, if I may use that term. I hope that that term is easily comprehensible to everyone. On the right, you have, so it was a bit difficult, finding data for African countries. Okay, so many of the PDI index listings, right, do not have data, specific data on African countries. So what I've done is that I found an aggregate data set somewhere, and the URL is here in the slides. When the organizers share the slides, you can have access to it. Where you see that we don't have the specific, but for the study that was carried out, the average PDI for African countries was discovered at 70 to be 71. Okay, so that means we can use an average is a measure of central tendency. It's a representative of the data set. So we can say averagely, it won't be too far to the left or to the right. It won't deviate too much from the average, but we can say that by and large, for all intents and purposes, at least for this discussion, we can use 71, right? And the higher you go, the higher you go, the higher you go on the PDI, the less agile, right? Or the less tendency for agility that you have, okay? Because where there is significant friction to share, for subordinates to share ideas freely with their superiors, then you find that it's difficult for organizations to innovate and or react to environmental stimulus, and that's what we define as agility. So that's the data, okay? Now let's take a bit of a focus and look at Africa, okay? So 2 observations from there. 14 out of the bottom 15 are African countries. The only one that is not an African country here is Haiti. And then you see that, I mean, that sounds, I don't know what to say about that, but hey, there's a lot of work to do on the African continent. That's the way I like to put it. So that's number one. The second point there is, like I said earlier, the average PDI, if you look at what I circled in the second screenshot, average PDI is 71 for African countries. And the interpretation of that is that subordinates generally expect to be told what to do. So there's low levels of initiative, there's low levels of, risk taking, there's low levels of experimentation, everything has to be an order, everything has to be sanctioned, everything has to be an order, a written order, send me an email, that kind of culture, so that's the data set. Having looked at the data set, I would like to submit to you that, so this is my submission in summary. I'd like to submit to you that as the data has shown us, as we observed from the data, when PDI is low, there is a high probability that the country within which that organization that has a low PDI is operating will be a rich country, a wealthy country. When PDI is high, there is a high probability that the country within which that organization that has a high PDI is operating will be a poor country. So pretty much, thank you very much. That's my submission. The rest are just a few recap there. These are the things we did earlier. This is just we defined the agility poverty correlation hypothesis. We established, we stated an assumption and analyzed it, did a test, and then we looked at the 15 richest countries, 15 poorest countries, and we focused on Africa. Thank you very much. Any questions? How did I do with
time? This is really interesting, Ado, and thank you so much for sharing this. You put together 2 topics that are closer to my heart: agility and poverty. And it's just fascinating to see that correlation happening. But what can be done? What's next now?
Okay. So forgive me for not making any recommendations. Forgive me for going on an academic, taking you on an academic exercise. Okay, so what I would suggest, right? They're not on the slides. But what I would suggest is a deliberate strategy by people in the agile communities in these poor countries. 14 out of 15 of them are African countries by extension. In African countries, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, other African countries, a deliberate concerted effort or attempt to introduce agility, right? If you want to start outside or beyond the organization level, you can start with things like ease of doing business, power distance index, things that are appreciable at the government/national levels. But then, obviously those things must cascade, and then we'll get to the organization level. We can start talking about the usual things that are in our popular frameworks, for measuring either team, program, or business unit metrics, agile performance metrics. Does that sound reasonable?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
what is the role of government in this to do?
So I'm not the expert. So this is a
I know.
Okay, so I would say, right, that if I can slightly modify that question.
Yeah, go ahead. Anyhow you want to slice it.
Okay. I'll slice it and say, what is the role of the agile community, right? The community of agile professionals, or the agile quote unquote experts, people who practice agile, who implement and advocate for agile. What's their role toward the government, right? Because again, the governments all over the world, and it's not just Africa, right? Governments all over the world are meant to be bureaucratic and more comfortable in their positions, right? So
absolutely,
if they're going to adopt, emerging agile enhancing philosophies and paradigms and practices, right? It's going to have to come from an external force that is pushing the benefits of that paradigm in their faces. So that's my humble opinion. I hope we can get more.
I'm just curious to know how you keep saying agile community, but then how can they influence things, right? And I don't even want to get to that level of what the government is going to do or how the government is going to help. But how can the agile community help in this instance? Right. Okay,
so I'll borrow from another hat that I frequently wear. Okay, so I'm usually I also coach startups, right? One of the things I've observed is that, or one of the things that I've been guilty of saying, and it sounds slightly cynical when I say it at the surface level, but when you think about it, it's the most empowering thing that anybody can say about Nigeria and by extension Africa. I often advocate that people should stop. So there's this 1985 newspaper clipping that I saw maybe a year or two ago that had this bold headline saying, "Dear Nigerians, we are promising you in 1985 that you will have uninterruptible power supply in the next 6 months." I remember seeing that newspaper clipping. I remember 1985. This is 2021. I was under 10 years old, right, in 1985. This is 30 years later, and we are still battling with uninterruptible power supply. My takeaway from that is that for Africa, for the big problems, right, for the big problems that have plagued Africa for decades to be solved, African individuals are going to have to volunteer to stand up and fix those problems. In the process of fixing those problems, some of them will become billionaires. Well, maybe when a few of those governments see that citizens are taking initiative and doing things, perhaps a few of them will get the cue and they will join in. So what I want to borrow from that is, I like I said, I don't intend to be cynical. I think it's more empowering to what we can do rather than waiting for governments to do a lot of things. And so my recommendation is, as a community, what can we do? The very barest minimum of what we can do is to operate, is to advocate, right? Write articles, create media boards, just shout on the hilltops, essentially about the benefits of what we are proposing and how it will change things. And that's the minimum. But we can do much more than that. We can actually hold stakeholder engagement sessions. We can find sponsorships. Let me not take too long. I'm sure you get my point.
I would take you up on this, Idowu, because the government which we have is shameless.
Okay.
You can't shame them, but I would love to have this discussion, at a later date, maybe not in this kind of forum. Anyway, thank you so much. This has been an eye-opener session, and we want to thank you for allowing us into your thoughts process of the hypothesis and coming up with some suggestions as well. So thanks.